When people talk about where economic thinking began, the conversation almost always starts in the West. Adam Smith appears as the father of markets. Marx arrives as the critic of capital, and Aristotle is sometimes granted a cameo as an early commentator on exchange. That storyline is tidy, memorable, and incomplete because it skips over an older and less celebrated tradition that treated money as a moral technology long before it was treated as an abstract variable. Nearly a millennium ago, in a world of coins and caravans rather than credit cards and algorithms, a Muslim scholar warned that money can corrode a civilization when it is severed from justice. His message was not that wealth is evil, but that societies decay when the pursuit of wealth overwhelms responsibility, honesty, and the trust that makes any economy possible. If you're interested in personal finance, hit subscribe and give this video a like right now. And now, let's move on. To grasp why Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali matters for this discussion, it helps to step into the early 12th century and resist the instinct to imagine the medieval world as uniformly stagnant. Around 1100 CE, much of Europe is still fractured into competing territories, with limited urban life and a relatively thin commercial infrastructure compared with what will come later. At the same time, the Islamic world spans an enormous belt of connected regions, from Al-Andalus in Spain, across North Africa and the Middle East into Persia. This is not a marginal world. It is a dense network of cities where scholarship and commerce reinforce each other. Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and other urban centers host libraries, courts, marketplaces, and institutions of learning, while trade routes carry spices, textiles, metals, ceramics, and paper across long distances with surprising regularity. The important detail is that this prosperity does not simply increase comfort, it changes the moral temperature of society. When money flows more quickly, status symbols become louder, inequality becomes more visible, and the incentives for manipulation become stronger. New wealth can build institutions, fund education, and expand opportunity, yet it can also tempt people to treat success as proof of righteousness, and to treat victims as collateral damage. Governments, especially when they feel insecure, look for revenue in the places that hurt least in the short term, and poison most in the long term. Merchants facing competition and price volatility can either compete through service or compete through deception. In other words, economic growth creates a new test of character, and that test is exactly where Al-Ghazali directs his attention. Al-Ghazali is often introduced as a theologian, and he certainly is one, but he is also a jurist, philosopher, and public intellectual who refuses to treat spiritual life as separate from social systems. Born in 1058 in Persia, he advances rapidly through scholarly circles and earns a prestigious teaching appointment while still relatively young. Yet his significance is not limited to status or eloquence, because he becomes a critic of the very conditions that helped elevate him. He looks at a society growing wealthier and more complex, and he senses that something is becoming unbalanced. The outward signs of success are everywhere, but beneath them, he perceives a drift toward obsession, anxiety, and moral compromise, as if prosperity is expanding faster than collective wisdom can keep it disciplined. The question he raises could be asked in almost any modern economy, which is precisely why it lands with such force. What happens when a civilization becomes rich faster than it becomes wise? And what happens when the rules of exchange reward clever extraction more than honest contribution? Instead of treating money as neutral, he treats it as an instrument that shapes behavior, because the way people use money rewires their incentives and their relationships. This is where his analysis becomes surprisingly contemporary, since he is not satisfied with describing how markets operate. He asks what markets do to people, and what happens to a society when money becomes the central measure of worth. For Al-Ghazali, money is a tool designed for exchange, not a treasure meant to be adored. The fact that currency may be made of gold or silver does not make it sacred, because the metal is only valuable insofar as it enables trust and cooperation among strangers. He uses an image that captures this idea with elegant precision, comparing money to a mirror. A mirror has no beauty of its own and no purpose beyond reflection, and its usefulness depends entirely on what it helps you see. Money, similarly, has no ultimate value within itself. It becomes meaningful only when it facilitates trade, specialization, and mutual benefit. When people start treating money as the point rather than the instrument, They reverse the logic of the system and invite social and psychological distortion. From this starting point, he develops a sharp critique of hoarding, and he frames it as a social problem rather than merely a personal vice. Wealth locked away in private storage does not feed labor, expand commerce, or stabilize households, and it cannot perform the function that justifies its existence. Al-Ghazali treats hoarded wealth as dead because it stops serving exchange, and a currency that does not circulate cannot support economic life. The damage is not symbolic, it is structural. When large sums are withheld from circulation, scarcity increases not because goods vanish, but because liquidity dries up in the places where ordinary people live. Prices shift, bargaining becomes harsher, and the burdens of instability fall on those with the least ability to absorb shocks. His point is not that saving is immoral or that every person must spend recklessly, because he recognizes the legitimacy of prudence. The target is the kind of hoarding that becomes an obsession, a status display, or a deliberate refusal to let wealth serve any social purpose. When money becomes a trophy, the economy begins to resemble a body whose circulation is blocked because the channels that connect producers, traders, and consumers tighten. Work becomes harder to fund, credit becomes more expensive, and suspicion grows about who is playing fair. In a prosperous society, the damage of hoarding can be masked for a while, but it accumulates quietly until the system begins to strain. The same moral and systemic logic shapes his hostility toward speculation and crisis profiteering. Al-Ghazali distinguishes between legitimate trade, where profit follows service and risk, and manipulative behavior, where profit follows deception and engineered scarcity. He condemns merchants who exploit emergencies, conceal information, manipulate prices, or create shortages to force desperate buyers into worse terms. This behavior is not simply unfair in his view, it is corrosive because it teaches the market that pain is a resource to be mined. He captures the moral core in a memorable judgment when he observes that whoever profits from the suffering of others profits from corruption, and corruption spreads like an infection once it becomes normalized. Importantly, he is not arguing for the abolition of trade or for an economy of ascetic withdrawal. He defends commerce as necessary, and he recognizes that specialization and exchange are natural features of human society. His concern is the ethical infrastructure without which markets cannot remain healthy. He attacks dishonest practice, false weights, misleading descriptions, hidden defects, and the strategic use of ignorance as an advantage. These behaviors undermine the expectation of fairness that allows people to transact efficiently, and once that expectation collapses, the economy becomes slower, more violent, and more fragile even if it continues to produce wealth for a narrow elite. In modern terms, his insight is that trust reduces friction. When trust is present, people can trade with less time spent verifying every detail and less fear of being trapped. And the system expands because cooperation becomes easier. When trust is absent, every transaction becomes an act of defense, and the costs of defense pile up across the whole economy. Courts become overloaded, contracts become longer, enforcement becomes harsher, and social resentment thickens. Al-Ghazali describes this mechanism without technical vocabulary, yet the logic matches what later economists formalize as transaction costs, information asymmetry, and moral hazard. He understands with striking clarity that the invisible foundation of the market is not the coin itself, but the credibility behind it. That credibility becomes even more fragile when rulers manipulate currency. And this is where his critique of political power becomes direct and uncompromising. Medieval governments, like modern ones, often face pressure to finance wars, patronage, and administration, and the temptation to stretch the money supply through coin debasement can look like an easy solution. By reducing the precious metal content of coins while keeping their nominal value, authorities can pay expenses today while pushing the loss onto the public tomorrow. Al-Ghazali condemns this as a form of theft because it violates the implicit contract between issuer and user. It is not clever governance. It is deception performed at scale, and it punishes the poor most harshly because the poor cannot protect themselves with diverse assets. He also anticipates the social response that follows repeated debasement, because people adapt quickly to betrayal. When money is weakened, those who can will hoard higher quality coins, demand payment in stronger forms, or shift to goods and foreign currencies that feel more reliable. The community's confidence in the official medium of exchange begins to dissolve, and once confidence erodes far enough, the currency becomes less a tool of cooperation and more a symbol of mistrust. Over time, this reaction can hollow out the state's fiscal base and destabilize the market from the top down, because everyone becomes uncertain about what any unit of money is truly worth. Al-Ghazali's warnings are sharpened by the political conditions he observes, because his era includes fragmentation, contested legitimacy, and competing centers of power. When rulers fear losing control, they often seek control through the economy first, since money and taxation touch every household. Some increase taxes beyond what communities can sustain, some seize assets, some borrow recklessly, and some manipulate coinage as a quieter way to extract resources. These measures can stabilize a regime for a season while weakening the foundations for a generation. Al-Ghazali's point is that injustice is not merely a moral failure, but a strategic error because it breaks the loyalty and cooperation a stable economy requires. He frames corruption as a downward cascade. When leaders cheat, they license cheating. When the state treats deception as policy, the market treats deception as competition. Merchants then feel entitled to deceive customers. Customers begin to deceive merchants. And the general expectation becomes that only a fool tells the whole truth. What emerges is an economic order in which distrust is rational, and in such an order, even honest people are pressured into dishonesty just to survive. The economy begins to function like a chain of traps, with each participant trying to avoid being the last person holding a worthless promise. This is why his central conclusion remains so stark. A society can endure poverty, but it cannot endure corruption. Economic collapse is rarely explained by the mere absence of resources, because humans have survived with little when they could cooperate and trust shared rules. Collapse comes when the glue of trust dissolves and when institutions fail to uphold fairness. Once that happens, people hoard because they do not believe tomorrow will be fair. They speculate because they believe stability is an illusion, and they exploit because they assume exploitation is the only winning strategy. At that point, even a wealthy society becomes brittle because wealth alone cannot substitute for legitimacy and confidence. Al-Ghazali's analysis also reveals how deeply he understands human psychology because he sees that the economy is built from choices shaped by fear and desire. People rationalize unethical profits because money feels abstract, because harm is dispersed, and because they can tell themselves that everyone would do the same in their position. They manipulate money precisely because it is easy to manipulate. And they call exploitation smart when they do not have to look directly at its consequences. He argues that laws matter, yet laws alone cannot save an economy if the incentive structure rewards deceit. If a society wants stability, it must align incentives toward productive behavior and make integrity the rational choice rather than a romantic gamble. This is where his insistence on responsibility becomes the heart of the argument. Wealth is not condemned in itself, and trade is not treated as a stain, but wealth without social purpose becomes dangerous. Prosperity lasts when people contribute more than they extract, when profit is connected to service, and when the community is not treated as a resource to be harvested. When accumulation becomes detached from duty, inequality intensifies, resentment grows, and the system loses resilience. The wealthy may believe they can protect themselves, yet their protection ultimately depends on institutions, stability, and a cooperative public, all of which wither under sustained injustice. At the end of the story, Al-Ghazali's medieval world collapses into the modern one with alarming ease. Today, money moves at digital speed, markets are global, and financial instruments are vastly more complex than coinage and caravans. Yet the underlying behaviors are familiar. Societies wrestle with concentrated wealth, speculative frenzies, and a persistent tendency to reward financial engineering more than productive contribution. Trust in institutions declines in many places, and debates about inflation and currency stability carry the same underlying anxiety that Al-Ghazali identified. Money functions because people believe in it, and belief evaporates when honesty becomes optional. His critique of hoarding resonates in discussions about concentrated capital and financial sheltering, because idle wealth can drain vitality from the broader economy. His critique of speculation echoes in fears about housing bubbles, leverage, and fragile markets that privatize gains while socializing losses. His condemnation of currency manipulation speaks to the perennial temptation of authorities to solve immediate problems by weakening the unit of trust that holds the system together. Above all, his focus on justice and integrity clarifies a truth that modern societies often forget. Economies do not fail only because the numbers are wrong, but because the human relationships beneath the numbers have been damaged. If his message still feels relevant, it is because it is not a medieval curiosity. It is a durable pattern. Money is not merely a mechanical object, and it is not a neutral commodity floating above morality. It is a social agreement, a belief system, and a framework of incentives that can either encourage honest contribution or reward clever harm. Al-Ghazali's warning, written centuries before modern financial crises made the point in headlines, is that prosperity cannot survive when justice is abandoned. When money loses its moral compass, societies do not merely face instability, they begin to rot from within, and eventually the system breaks under the weight of its own distrust.